welcome you all to this year's Philip N. Backstrom Survivor Lecture. This year, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Agnes Kaposi joining us all the way from London. These are Zoom has its disadvantages, but it also has its advantages, and being able to have guests from far away is one of the wonderful advantages. So a little bit about this series, which started really from the beginning of the history of the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee at Northeastern University in the 1970s, with survivors who were at the time quite a bit younger and more plentiful, joining students and faculty to discuss, sometimes in dorms, sometimes in classrooms, their experiences in informal conversation. As the activities of the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee became more formalized, or at the time the Holocaust Awareness Committee, this lecture became formalized, and it became an annual lecture in which a speaker or speakers would come during Holocaust Awareness Week and deliver a testimonial. And these events would pack classrooms and pack lecture halls with students and faculty who were eager to hear firsthand testimony of both atrocity and survival. The lecture series was given the formal name, the Philip N. Backstrom Lecture Series, in 1998, named after a longtime professor of European history at Northeastern University, Philip N. Backstrom Jr., who'd been instrumental in setting up the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee, Holocaust Awareness Committee at the time, and bringing in survivors to lecture. And this was a way of honoring his work for the committee and the university and advocacy for human rights more generally. And I'm delighted to see, this is one of the benefits of seeing the participants, Diana Backstrom here as a participant, because part of this is to honor the work that he did. Since then, these lectures have been enormously popular and enormously important. They have been recorded. They have been digitally archived in our digital repository service and in our Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee archives. There has been an enormous amount of work, both by our librarians and students, to create searchable archives, transcripts, and other materials that help make these presentations and these testimonies very useful for pedagogy and for researchers. So this year, I'm delighted to announce that we have Dr. Agnes Kaposi joining us all the way from London. Now, Dr. Kaposi is not just a Holocaust educator, but she is one of the United Kingdom's and indeed one of the world's most prominent engineers. She is only the third woman to have been elected to the United Kingdom's Royal Society for the Royal Academy of Engineers, and had a long career as a professor, specializing in electrical engineering and computer-aided design at what is now London South Bank University. And it's wonderful, especially to have her at Northeastern, which has such a strong specialty in engineering. And looking at the participants, I'm also delighted that we have our chair of the electrical and computer engineering department joining us as well. So Professor Agnes Kaposi also had a second career in Holocaust education. She published her memoir, which is entitled Yellow Star, Red Star, which she's going to talk to us about today, and was awarded for her work in Holocaust education by Queen Elizabeth II, made a member of the British Empire. And for those of you from the Commonwealth like myself, that is a very big deal. So we're really very fortunate to have her here. And especially at a time unfortunately, of renewed relevance and importance for the work that we do. There are, of course, discussions daily now about whether Russia's atrocities in Ukraine constitute genocide. That, I think, still determines, is still yet to be determined. However, there is no doubt that it constitutes war crimes, atrocities, and crimes against humanity, and will create another generation of survivors and people who we will need to hear from to relate their experiences and their testimony. But it also makes the work that we do here even more important, and the significance of having Dr. Kaposi even greater. So before I pass it on to her, I just want to thank all of the people who worked very hard to make this event possible. First and foremost, the members of the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee, my wonderful colleague, Professor Lori Lefkowitz, who's the director of the Center for Jewish Studies, and the director of the Humanities Center, which also sponsors this programming. The Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, Dr. Uta Poiger, are always generous donors, and the several people who did much of the setup and legwork to get this running: Gabby Fiorenza, Jennifer Grieve, Deborah Levison, and Robin Heller as well. So, Dr. Kaposi, we are very much looking forward to hearing from you. And the final thing that I just want to add is that there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. So you don't need to ask questions in the chat yet, but at the end, we'll have a discussion. You'll be able to ask questions via the chat, and I can read them out, or you can write RTS in the chat for request to speak, and I can call on you.
Thank you very much for this occasion, this opportunity for me to come to meet with you. I would have liked to come in person, and circumstances are such, including I recently had a big accident, and traveling across the water twice within a week would have been more than at the moment in my 90th year I can undertake. So instead, here it is, we are taking advantage of Zoom, and I welcome the opportunity and cherish the opportunity of meeting with you and talking to you. Maybe have some slides, please. The first slide I want to show you, the next one, please, picks out the first of a series of keywords that I should like to use in course of my discussion. Simon mentioned testimonial and memory. These are difficult things. I didn't talk about what happened to me during the Holocaust and subsequently until relatively recently, when one of my granddaughters asked me. And I became aware that I can't really trust my own memory. Those of you who are lawyers would know how unreliable testimonials are. People might relate the same event 2 days running slightly differently. And I was to talk about things that happened decades before when I was a little girl. So I felt the responsibility of questioning my own memory. And I became aware that you can take up two different stances. One, that you are telling your story as a participant, or else as an observer, as a witness who is not taking personally part. And while I am going to talk to you about things that happened to me, I tried quite deliberately to become more distant from it in order to make my stories more reliable. Also, I was hunting for confirmation of a historian of some of the details and some of the interpretations. And I was very lucky. If you read my book, you will see I was lucky to have encountered the collaboration of a Holocaust historian, half my age, but of great wealth of knowledge, particularly about Hungarian Holocaust history. So this book is mine as well as his. May we go on to the next slide, please? And I want to start by telling you where I come from. I come from a tiny little country, which unfortunately recently has become so notorious that you hear about it more and more. It always was, but it is now better known. They just re-elected yesterday, right-wing, populist man without, I would say, without honor. This is somebody who is tying the country to the wrong string. He is making Hungary the ally of Russia in a particular situation like we find ourselves. It always was a problematical country. I was born in a small, a large provincial city compared with the capital, a small city, Debrecen. That's where I came from. And very soon after my birth, my family moved on to the capital, and that is where I was brought up. And I shall tell you the story from then onwards. The next slide, please. It flags up keyword of identity. One's identity was challenged. On the left-hand side, I have here a whole sequence of those things that describe me. I am a dislocated Hungarian. I'm a Jew without religion. I'm an immigrant to Britain, and those of you who listen to my speech will know I speak this language lovingly and carefully, but with a foreign accent. I am the survivor of not one, but two different tyrannies. I was, after arriving in the UK, I acquired experience as an engineer, but I was an outsider yet again. Women engineers are few, and that was rubbed in course of my British career really consistently, that I didn't really belong to the engineering corpus. The top right-hand picture there is the cover page of a profile that was created of me by the Royal Academy of Engineering, and they describe me exactly correctly. I have always been an outsider. My identity was, if you like, questionable throughout my life, and to some extent still is. The next slide, please. The next keyword is exclusion. My earliest memories as a preschool child were these kinds of horrible pictures, and there were lots of others. I could have given you many more than this. They were disturbing. They appeared everywhere, in photographs, in pictures on the walls, in newspapers. Most disturbing for me was the pink one here. The text in Hungarian reads, "Brother, do you want to change this injustice? Join the arrow cross." Well, not being brought up in a Jewish family, these yellow stars everywhere were not particularly familiar to me. And I asked my father, who are these Jews who we are to kill? Who are these horrible people? And are you going to join the arrow cross to right the injustice of these people being so skinny and poor, and those others who are obviously the Jews to be killed, dripping with jewels and being fat and ugly? And my father said, well, we are those Jews. And I find it difficult to understand this preschool child as I was, 3, 4 years of age or 5, And I said, but you haven't got big noses and we are not rich. In fact, we are quite poor. None of us are fat. So why do people hate us? Why do they want to kill us? And that's when my father disappointed me for the first time, because I was quite convinced that he knew absolutely everything. And to this question, why they hate us, he had to confess he doesn't have an answer for me. So here I was excluded as a preschool child because I was a Jew, and the local children were not allowed to play with the only Jewish girl on the block. And so this is my, if you like, my earliest memories about being a Jew and being excluded. The next slide, please. Exclusion reached my entire family and the Jews in general. In fact, the first law against Jews was against all minorities. It was in 1920, it's very early. It was a law which restricted the number of Jews and minority people to go to study in universities, to go into higher education in 1920, as early as that. Subsequently came other laws against the Jews, and the one which particularly hit my family, as you will see, is the second Jewish law, which came about before the outbreak of the World War in 1939, restricting Jewish participation in the professions to 6%. Now, this was difficult because at that time, statistics would show you about half the doctors, the engineers, the journalists, the lawyers of the country were Jews, whereas the population was between 5 and 6% Jewish. And they had a problem, and their way of dealing with the problem of imbalance, the Jews playing too big a part in professional life, that was to restrict participation of Jews. That meant that members of my family who graduated in about 1939 or thereabouts, when the law came to force, they got their degrees and they never ever managed to get a job. The next slide will show you some of the young men and women of my family, and they were all professional people, as the list shows you. My father was the chartered accountant among them. These were, as I just told you, excluded from society, and they had no children. In the first 8 years of my life, I was the only child of the extended family. In a way, this was a lucky thing for me, because these wonderful young men and women had time for me, played with me, so I didn't have a lonely childhood, although I was an only child. I didn't have playmates of my own age, but I had plenty of playmates, of these of my uncles and my father, who had time for me, explained to me things. I had a good time as a child. The next slide, please. Exclusion followed me into school as well. I was, as I told you, growing up in Budapest. The school building is here. This is very near the Houses of Parliament, is where we lived. My mother was the sole breadwinner of the entire extended family. We were extremely poor, but I did well at school. The school had a junior section and a high school section. The junior section is the further on the picture, the further gate, and through that I went for 4 years and I did very well. The expectation was that I will proceed to the senior school, but even during the junior years, I was treated in such a way by one of the teachers who, by her own confession, was in love with Hitler. She said she hated Jews. She behaved towards me accordingly. So I was already excluded to some extent in my junior years. And then when came the senior, the move to the high school, there's a red line showing I was not admitted into the high school, no matter how good a student I was, because they describe this now to be a purely Aryan institution. No Jews permitted. The picture on the right, me at the age of 10, shows you what that period of schooling did to me. I grew up earlier than I should have done, under sadder circumstances that should have been my lot normally. Next slide, please. War came. War came in 1939, days after I started my junior school. And the Hungarian Holocaust could be described as a tragedy in 3 acts. The first act played out very early. Hungary joined the war on Hitler's side in 1941. My uncles were drafted into the Hungarian army. All Jews were. At the beginning, it was the normal army population. Later, it extended from 16 to 60, all Jews into the army. They were taken to the Ukrainian front without arms, without uniforms, and treated in such a way that these of my uncles and many others whose photographs I don't show you, they never came back. This list shows the artist, the banker, the lawyer, and the civil engineer uncle. But so did many of my others. They disappeared from my life at the age of 8. Next slide. This was the first act of the Hungarian Holocaust, what happened to the men. Well, the civilian population was really treated relatively well, in spite of the laws against the Jews. We still lived in our own homes. The women and the children were still, we were poor, of course, but we did exist until the 19th of March, 1944, when everything suddenly changed. The Germans occupied their allied Hungary, and with Hungarian collaboration, they brought about what happened to the civilian population. This was the second and third acts of the Hungarian Holocaust. I show you here a group of Germans marching in Hungary. Adolf Eichmann brought in 170 Germans, that was all, for the purpose of getting rid of about 800,000 Hungarians. This was too much to ask, even from the Germans, so they needed Hungarian collaboration. The collaboration came from the gendarmerie, and on the right-hand side, you have a picture of the noble gendarmes. This was an armed force altogether. Altogether, the gendarmes and the police counted 36,000 heads, and their job included implementing the solution of the Jewish question. We knew immediately the Germans arrived. We knew that something horrible was going to happen. We lived in fear. But there was total uncertainty, and from one moment to the next, we didn't know what next is going to happen. May we have the next slide, please? What happened was that a month after the Germans arriving came the Yellow Star Law. Exactly what that law was to achieve, I do not know, but it is an identity problem. You were not just deprived of your identity as an individual, you were branded as a Jew with a yellow star of a given color and proportions which you had to wear, so that people on the street from a long distance away could tell who you were. You were excluded from shops, from places of entertainment. That was the Yellow Star Law. What that was to achieve, I am not really sure. It didn't last long as far as my own experience is concerned, because the next law came, next slide please, the next month. And that was the ghetto law. Now, to describe for you what ghetto life was like, let me show you my grandmother's little home. She lived in Debrecen, my native city, and there was an old house, like you see in the picture, with a big courtyard, and the top left-hand home was Nanoka's home. Nanoka was my childish name for my grandmother. Nanoka's home, she was a widow, consisted of 2 rooms and a kitchen. The toilet was outside in the yard for all the inhabitants of the building. There was no bathroom, so we washed in the kitchen. Nevertheless, it was a place I loved being, and I spent most of my summers there. In the winter time, the school times, I was back in Budapest, of course. Well, when the ghetto law came in May 1944, it so happened that my grandmother's building fell into the area designated as the ghetto. And on the right-hand side, you can see the little brown dotted lines. They blotted out the windows, the gateways, and so on. So there was no entry into the courtyard anymore, other than breaking through the home of one of the Jewish families from the next building further along. And people were jammed into the ghetto, to the extent that there were lots of Jewish families who camped in the courtyard because there was no room for them in the building itself. My whole family, that is to say, not the men were already dead by then, but the women and the children, they all moved back from Budapest to my grandmother's home because we just felt that the family should be together. There is the big trouble, the Germans have occupied the country. So we all crowded into my grandmother's home. And so did those few members of the extended family who had lived in Debrecen at the time. The next slide, please. I acquaint you with some members of my ghetto family. The little lady sitting upright in her chair in the bottom right-hand corner is my grandmother, Nanoka. She stood something like 4'6". She was a bundle of energy, intelligence, organization, and without her intervention, we would not have stayed alive. In various ways, we have our very lives to thank to her organization and cleverness. There were 2 toddlers among us, little Eva on the top and little George at the bottom. My Aunt Mary is crossed out because she didn't come to Debrecen. She was sent to Auschwitz from another part of Hungary and murdered. The left-hand side lists all the extended family who was in the ghetto. There were 3 grannies, my 2 grandmothers and the mother-in-law of one of my aunts. There was only 1 man, my sick father, who was in his mid-40s. There were 5 women, and then soon there were 4 only. There were 3 little children, the 2 you see and 1 more, little Gabi, soon reduced. I'll tell you why and how. And there was me, aged 11, except I was soon to be 14, and that I will explain as well. My mother's artist cousin was killed together with his little boy by the gendarmes, even in Hungary, even before we were deported. Deportation comes in the next section of our history. And I became responsible. I acquired adult responsibility, as I will explain. So from the age of 11, suddenly we declared I was 14, as I will tell you why. Responsibility became a key word of my existence then and remained remains to this very day responsibility. Next slide, please. Well, deportation came. Deportation started in Hungary, as I will show you in the next slide, on the 14th of May, 1944, and finished on the 9th of July, 1944, 56 days. And our particular train left Debrecen's brickyard near the ghetto on June the 27th, 1944, in a wagon exactly like that. 87 of us traveled for 5 nights and 4 days without water, without food, and without sanitation, 87 people. The map is interesting. Almost everybody, 437,000 Hungarian Jews were taken to Auschwitz. Our train, the Red Line, was also heading for Auschwitz and crossed the border to Czechoslovakia. And it's to this day, it's not certain why we were diverted instead. And our train became one of 4 trains that fetched 15,000 people to Vienna instead. Why this happened, I can give you some explanation, although not full. Historians are not sure of all the details. Why this single train, just one, was so diverted. And that's why I can tell you this story. Here is an artist's impression of what it was like mounting the train. Of course, I have no photograph of it, but I remember it to be just as you describe, as the artist draws. The next slide, please. Well, here now you can see Act 2 of the Hungarian Holocaust tragedy. This 437,000 Jews who in 56 days were taken to Auschwitz, and the survival rate was so little as to be negligible. This is so late in the war. As you know, Auschwitz was both a work camp and a death camp. And they saved for work those people who they thought were strong enough to work, except by now it was so late that there was no work needed. All they needed to do was to get rid of 437,000 Jews in 56 days, a great achievement of the German Reich. And on the 9th of July, at the end of the 56 days, Eichmann could report to Hitler proudly, Hungary's provinces are Judenrein, clear of Jews. Now, notice the word provinces. They did not manage to get rid of the Jews of Budapest. The provinces have been cleared, as I just explained. The next slide, please. When we arrived in Austria with that red line train that I just showed you before, we fetched up near Vienna in a place called Strasshof. And here is the issue of identity. From thereafter, we didn't have any name, we had a number. My identity card was lost. And a friend of mine, Gabor Levkovich, preserved his and allowed me to reproduce his identity card. My card was exactly the same with a different name and a different number. And mine said that I was 11 years old. At that time, I still was 11 years old. That didn't last long. The next slide, please. Now came the next period, and here the keyword is slavery. We worked as slaves. The worst period for me, and I think for most of us, was the beginning from July until the end of the year. In fact, the beginning of December, we worked in a farm. This was a state-owned farm. Some people said that we worked 12-hour days. I have no idea because nobody had a watch. But we worked from before sunup to past sundown. The place is remarkable. It's one of the tests to my own memory, because I remembered that we were in a farm, state-owned farm, underneath a medium wave transmitter tower. And when I wanted to include this picture of Magdalenenhof in my book, I couldn't find the transmitter tower. Oh, well, my memory is wrong. I must have dreamt it somewhere or whatever. But I researched it, and I found from the history of Austrian radio broadcasting that there was the medium wave transmitter at Bisamberg Magdalenenhof, exactly where those white buildings are on my picture. That is where the transmitter tower had stood, and the Germans exploded it when they evacuated the area in April 1945. So I did remember rightly. And how I can even tell you, you can see a road running east-west at the top of the picture, and it's called Senderstraße. In German, that means Transmitter Street. And when I found the name of the street, that's when I began to think, well, maybe I do remember correctly. There must have been a sender, a transmitter. Well, the work we did there nearly broke us. It was vicious, cruel work. And only those were given any food who worked. And the working age was 14 to 60. Now, there were 2 toddlers in my family, 2 young, and 3 grannies too old to work. And if we confessed that I was 11, there would have been in the ghetto family 5 members only who earned any food, and 6 of us who didn't. So I suggested to my family that we lie, that I am 14, and that's how I acquired adult responsibility at the age of 11. And I worked with the adults. Nobody made any concession for me, and I expected none, but it earned a little bit of food for the family. Well, we moved on when the farming season finished. We moved on to make anti-aircraft guns for the Wehrmacht. This was in Vienna itself, in the 10th district of Vienna. And I even have here the record of the type of gun that we were making. And when the factory was bombed to shreds, because it was the last functioning armament factory of the Reich, so it became the key target. Well, when the factory could no longer work, then for a while we cleared bomb damage in beautiful Vienna. And that was by then the beginning of 1945. The next slide, please. Meanwhile, in Budapest, the third act of the Hungarian Holocaust had been played out. Many of you will have seen the iconic building of the parliament, 2 corners away from this place where I went to school. Below it is a picture of the center of Budapest, which is where I grew up. The black spots are the places where the Germans, I beg your pardon, the Nazis, the Hungarian Nazis, murdered Jews, shooting them into the river. The one which is surrounded by the red line, the spot, that is where my Aunt Rose was shot into the river. Had we not joined my grandmother in the provinces, we would have been with my Aunt Rose, and I wouldn't be here telling you this story. The picture on the right is the famous memorial of the shoes. This is a Holocaust memorial in Budapest, and I mean, the story is obvious. This is, in fact, at the corner where my Aunt Rose was shot into the river. Well, the next slide, please. That finishes the Hungarian Holocaust. This gives you some of the statistics, and it might surprise even you, although I know how very knowledgeable you are. 4.6 million, round figures, were the Polish Soviet area of losses. The next largest is 600,000 Jews were lost in Hungary. Twice as many as in Romania, 3 times as many as Germany and Austria combined, twice as many as the rest of Europe all put together. It's an absolute outrage what happened to Hungary's Jews. The next slide, please. For completeness sake, I include here some statistics as to other losses of the Nazi regime who were not Jews. There are lots of approximate signs there because the statistics are not reliable and maybe never will be. The next slide, please. Well, we were liberated by the Soviet army. We were liberated from Strasov, the very spot where we first arrived. Here are some pictures. I have some very interesting memories of the Soviet army, including their brutality, the way they treated women, and including their musicality. It was an extraordinary thing that these Russian peasants in the army, and they were not a well-trained army, they were a devoted army. When a group of them got together, they sang the most beautiful folk songs in 2-3-part harmony. But they didn't do anything for us. They didn't help us. They didn't look after those of us who were just about alive. My father, who was a man of middle stature, at least of average height originally, was a skeleton weighing 70 pounds. You measure weight in pounds. He was a skeleton. And lots of people were dying of starvation. We then started going back to Hungary, as I say, without any help and with some hindrance from the Soviet army. The next slide, please. The distance from Vienna to Budapest is 230 kilometers, something like that, 150 miles. It took us a month. Why? Because of the way we were physically, because we were still starved, there was absolutely no transport of any kind. The only transport that came was the Russian transport, the Soviet transport going the other way, armored vehicles. The roads were torn up and so on. Well, it took us a month. And you may very well ask, why did we go back to Hungary? Well, there were 2 reasons, and the main reason was that we thought that we shall meet up with our men. We didn't know they were all dead. And also we thought that we might regain our home. We had been displaced from our home for a year and more. So we thought we might get back to our home, and we never regained our home, neither our home nor our possessions. I have 2 pictures there about beautiful Budapest. It is a beautiful city. One is the tourist brochure picture, and the other what it looked like at that time. That is the famous chain bridge. The next slide, please. Oh, note responsibility is still a keyword here. Let me tell you why. I was by then 12 years old. My father had been ill and was then a walking skeleton, as I told you. And my mother, her spine was injured while we were still in our camps by the work that we were forced to do. And so at the age of 12, I had responsibility for my parents, my ailing parents, but I also had to go to school. Well, the communist regime got hold very shortly. It was called the dictatorship of the proletariat, as you would know. This was a single party system with elections, but with no democracy. It's very interesting if you contrast this with what Viktor Orban, the present Hungarian leader, is saying. He is very proud that Hungary is a democracy, but not a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is a pejorative term as far as he's concerned. And he will tell you, he will explain to you why liberal democracy is Western and decadent. And the democracy which Hungary now has is a democracy by election, but it's not liberal, it is nationalistic. Well, here is a picture. It didn't help the Jewish population that the great post-war Hungarian leader, Rákosi, was a Jew, and the communist leadership, all of them, were the Hungarian version of the KGB and others. They were all Jews. It certainly didn't help those of us Jews who had to live under this regime. The next slide, please. There were some nice things that happened, a couple. One that I was still 12 when I met this young man. He was 16 at the time. And when I was 19, he married me. And like the beautiful Schumann song in the Frauenliebe und Leben, it would have suited us. The song says, "Now you have caused me the first pain." The first time he caused me any pain was when he died. He gave me a beautiful life and a beautiful family. Well, also a good thing that happened during this time was that I got my degree. My timing is exquisite, as you saw. I started school when the war broke out, and I graduated but a few months before the Hungarian Revolution broke out. The red degree is of significance. It indicates academic distinction, but it is also interesting that it was not awarded by the university, it was awarded by the state. It is the state of the emblem of the state, which is on the degree certificate. There was nothing. There was no identity. There was no individuality. There was no person. There was only the state. The next slide, please. Well, the revolution came in October 1956, as I said, a few months after my graduation. The angry mob pulled down Stalin's statue. Look at the two pictures on the left. The one at the top, the statue is still standing there. And you can see how huge it was, how many times bigger than the characters walking underneath it. And the mob pulled it down, and the picture below shows his head. Can you imagine what fury they had, what instruments they must have used to drag down the statue and beat it apart to have its head there. Anyhow, there are some photographs here about the revolution being sorted by the Soviet army. And we, as far as my husband and I were concerned, it was enough. Hungary, we had done Hungary. The revolution gave us an opportunity and we escaped. The next slide, please. About post-revolution, Hungary established itself as a Red Star state under János Kádár. It wasn't quite as fierce as it was during the 1950s when we lived there. Nevertheless, it was a communist state until the regime change, which came in 1989. But in the meantime, my husband and I moved to the United Kingdom. The next slide, please. it was not easy. Nothing ever in my life was easy. This was a 6-week journey of freezing. This was winter time, and hunger and misery. And why it was so, I could tell you if you are interested. Ask me a few questions about it. We arrived in Britain on the 27th of January 1957, and it so happens by chance that the job that we could obtain, which permitted us to enter Britain, and here is my labor permit to prove it, was in Cambridge, an electronics and communication company called Pi Limited. So there we are, we had arrived. We set foot on the country on the 27th of January 1957, and we didn't know that about, 5 decades later, the 27th January will be designated Holocaust Memorial Day in the UK. I'm not sure it is because of our own history. They might have had some other reason, like, for example, the liberation of Auschwitz. That might have been the main reason why they designated this day, but nevertheless. So here we are. The next slide, please. I have experienced in this country displacement, bereavement. I can only describe the loss of my family, the loss of my parents, the possibility of never seeing them again because we left the country illegally, and John's elderly, my husband's elderly parents, and the extended family. I can't explain to you the pain of the loss of the family was. I can only liken it to bereavement. And then there was a problem of identity, of course. My husband didn't speak a single word of English. I knew some Shakespeare sonnets and so on, but I couldn't hold a conversation. We had left behind Hungarian culture, our very cultural base, the folk music, the poetry, and so on, into which we were born, and we were aliens in this country. But we were graduates and we had jobs. And on the positive side, we had freedom and dignity and equality. I can tell you that not once in all the 65 years of living here did I experience any abuse or discrimination because I was a Jew or because I was a foreigner. Plenty of it because I was a woman engineer, of course. So I wasn't equal, but that wasn't because of me being a foreigner and a Jew. And in due course, working hard, they even allowed me to gain professional recognition, as Simon very kindly mentioned. The next slide, please. Well, Hitler has not won. This is my family. There is a big, painful gap in my family. I had 2 beautiful daughters. If you look carefully above between the 2 youngsters on the right-hand side, there's a photograph of my daughter Esther. She died 18 years ago, and of cancer. She left us 2 daughters, and my daughter Anna has 3 children, and I am inordinately fond of my sons-in-law as well. So this is my family. It was made, the picture was made very recently. There is now an exhibition which is traveling the country. In the Imperial War Museum, they had an exhibition for Holocaust survivors' families, and this was my family's picture there. Next slide, please. Well, what is Hungary like today? Here is Viktor Orbán. The way they deal with the Hungarian contribution to the Holocaust history is represented here in this ugly monument, together with the gathering of evidence by Hungarian Jews showing that it is a lie what the monument says. The monument describes Hungary as the victim of Nazism. No, they were not the victim. They were the perpetrators. The red poster over there says history falsification, intellectual poisoning. That is what those red letters say. Well, this is what the country is like, and what happened yesterday is a further illustration. The last slide is the next one I want to show you. And that is my effort at forgiveness. Hating is not very helpful for the hater. It does not harm the hated. So I tried to see that I could reconcile myself with the Germans, with the Hungarians, and with the Ukrainians. These are the only ones only nationalities that I came across. But the Germans have done their best. I must say they have done their best, and present-day Germany is worthy of an attempt at forgiveness. Hungary is a contemptible country, led by a contemptible leader. The Ukrainians we met them only little, but they were pretty brutal. They were worse than any other. I was actually beaten by a Ukrainian while I was working in the agricultural camp. But they are doing their best, and I visited Ukraine about 2 years ago. And I thought that they are worthy of forgiveness. And that's my story. I hope that you will have lots of questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaposi, for that really, really wonderful presentation. And now I'd just like to open it up to the audience. Who can either add I'll read the chats, who can either add a question to the chat and I can read it aloud, or can write RTS and I'll call on you.
Well, I would rather you read it, or you tell me, or people speak up, or however.
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, I'd be delighted to get things started by asking you about your experiences in Budapest after the war and under the communist regime, because I think there are a lot of questions, and in fact, if you look at Ukraine today and the question of how the Holocaust is remembered in Ukraine today, a lot, of course, has to do with the experience of post-war communism. And I'm just wondering about your sort of firsthand experience in Budapest in those years you were there after the war. How was your experience treated? How was what were those years like? I'm wondering if I could have some richer details on that particular aspect of your story.
Well, there are two aspects to it. One is the Holocaust experience, the Jewish experience, right? And the other is communist life in general. The very first Hungarian words we heard when we arrived on Hungarian soil, I'm trying to quote them in my book, and they amount to something like, "Rotten Jews, couldn't you have perished over there? Why did you come back to spoil the air around here?" And this was said in so many words. These were the first Hungarian words we heard. I haven't heard anything as brutal as that, only similar, once or twice at school. I myself can't say that I was ever in any way physically attacked. But recently I learned from my historian, Dr. Csős, who is the co-author of my book, I came across a record of a pogrom near a village near Debrecen, my native city. And I telephoned him, outraged, my goodness, there was a pogrom. And he said, well, yes, you are naive. You don't know that there were pogroms everywhere, and the communist press suppressed them. And you don't know, but we do. And we historians have dug them up, physically even digging them up. They are now digging shallow graves up as well as deeper ones up of, for example, Budapest Jews being death marched. Budapest Jews, the third act of the Hungarian Holocaust story, the Budapest Jews, some of them were shot into the river, but they couldn't get rid of all the Jews in that way. There were huge death marches westwards. They were then put on slave labor, digging trenches, trying to hold up the Soviet army's advance, useless effort. And then in Kőszeg and Hidegség and so on, there are a number of places where in the last decade, farmers have found bones and then they started digging. And then there are tens of thousands who are being dug up now. So there are all those. There were all kinds of atrocities like this, of which we were not aware because the press is so effective. And you can see how effective it is now because of the reports you hear of the Russians being ill-informed or uninformed. So we were not informed. What I did experience, though, was either indifference or verbal abuse. I would say almost no interest and no sympathy. But then there is the communist angle. If you compare the way in which the Nazi Star regime, the Yellow Star regime was held in place, and the Red Star regime, the Yellow Star regime was held in place by the enthusiastic collaboration of the population. They loved the notion of Nazism, of anti-Semitism. The Hungarians bought into it. And it is unfair to say that every Hungarian was a Jew hater, but it's almost not unfair. It is, you know, you could count on, in my personal history, on fingers maybe of two hands of those cases where there was true sympathy shown to us Jews. Now, so that was on the Yellow Star period, but the Red Star period was held in place by fear. There were these overlapping circles of spies. Everybody was spying on everybody else under one or another aegis. You were the organizer of the men's choir to sing party songs, whatever. And as such, you had to report every week who came to the rehearsals and who didn't. And somebody else was the organizer of the daily newspaper reading before working days started. And you had to report who was there and who wasn't. And you were being observed by those who were party functionaries, whether you reported correctly or not. So whether you wanted to spy on others or not, you were compelled to participate in one way of these overlapping circles of spies, and everybody was afraid of everyone else. People were afraid of their own children or their own spouses. Certainly friendships were a very, very difficult thing because you committed yourself to a friendship and you therefore revealed your ideas to a friend. And what if the friend deceived you or was not careful enough? And so that was the life.
Thank you so much. That really does enrich the story. I want to give some people in the audience a chance to speak, and we'll start with Carrie-Anne Roche. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I actually have two questions, if you don't mind. The first, how were you and your husband treated when you left Hungary in '56, going to England? Did you find people that helped you along, or were you basically on your own? And have you been back to Hungary since living in England?
Well, in the case of the way we were treated. The kindness was overwhelming, but it was difficult to administer. It was very difficult, for example, for a colleague to be kind to my husband who didn't speak a word of English. But nevertheless, the goodwill was everywhere. And it was one of the most difficult things for us to realize that a total stranger is not to be feared. But a stranger in the street, a policeman or a neighbor, is either indifferent or more likely willing to help. And we were not accustomed to that. For us, a stranger was always a threat. That was the experience we had in our previous life. It took me years before not getting a panic attack when there was somebody in a uniform approaching me on the street. I had to dive into a side street because there was a Salvation Army major or anything in uniform was a threat. Now, in England, this was not the case. We found general benevolence and kindness, and it went only so far. It didn't go very far when it came to socializing. But then it took us a while to discover that many of the people didn't socialize with each other either. So it's not us being excluded. They just had a much smaller life than we would have had we lived among our friends. And as we live now, continental Jews have a different style of life than a provincial Englishman.
Carrie Ann also asked about whether you've been back to Hungary at all.
Oh, yeah. I had gone back as soon as there was, what is the word? Remind me the word, when you are forgiven the crime that you have committed. With an A, I'm getting old and I forget sometimes. So we were criminals, right? Because we left the country without permission. But after a decade or so, they decided to forgive these criminals, mostly because they wanted foreign currency to be flowing in by people from the West visiting their relations. And I wanted to visit my grandmother and members of my family. And my husband particularly wanted to visit his elderly parents. My parents joined us in the UK. But we visited people first for this reason, and found the people there still the same, indifferent. They would never love Jews. They had no interest, but we didn't want to see them. We wanted to see the family. Later, when I began to make some name for myself, then my university invited me more than once, and I advised them on their research program in one particular instance. So I did travel professionally. I was always uncomfortable. After returning, for months after, I would have dreams of nightmares of going back to the country and not being able to get out again. And nowadays I don't visit the country. And I want to mention to you, my cousin is one of the great musicians of our age, and he was a graduate of the famous Franz Liszt Academy of Music. He's 20 years younger than I am. He visited in his world tours. He travels everywhere and gives concerts in Boston and everywhere else. And he went to Hungary. And then he began to get threatening letters of having his hands chopped off or whatever, because he was a Jew. And nowadays he does not travel.
Well, it's interesting because we have the next comment relates to these connections and today's Hungary. And Shelby Shapiro just wanted to point out the irony of Orban's continued use of anti-Semitic imagery and stereotyping, especially the sort of demonization of George Soros
Yes.
that the current government engages in.
Well, may I mention this? I don't know how well known this is, but Orban was a brilliant student, and he came, I think it is his postgraduate degree that he did in Oxford on a Soros scholarship. So he is, in fact, a Soros scholar.
I didn't even know that.
Well, look it up. And either he was an undergraduate at Oxford or a postgraduate at Oxford, or both.
Oh, I think that's what Shelby meant by the irony of Orban's education, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
really
it continues then because Hungary drew tremendous benefits from the European funding regimes, and now describes the European Union as their great enemies. The great enemies are the United States and Western countries in general, and the European Union. And the European Union is still funding quite a lot of the development projects of the country.
Yeah, many ironies. We have a question from Victoria Miles.
Hi, thank you so much. This was amazing, and it's wonderful to hear your story from a firsthand account. It's unbelievable. And I just had a quick question on if you could talk a little bit more about how you ended up finding the opportunity in Cambridge and in the UK. Like, how did you get that job to get the visa? Like, where did that come from? And I'm so curious how that happened.
Well, you know, it's a cliche to say, oh, thank you for the wonderful, that in fact, it is a wonderful question. We left Hungary on foot and under difficult, do read my book because it's quite a to-do of how we left Hungary, walking across the border and minefields and barbed wire and all that, and arriving in Vienna. Now, this is in 1956, December. And I speak good German or spoke, and my husband much better than I. So we understood the loud hailers shouting, anybody able-bodied should go to the first railway station and leave Vienna because the city is buckling under 150,000 refugees. There is going to be disease and famine and so on because we cannot absorb this number of refugees all of a sudden. And so we were young, public-spirited. We went to the first railway station and climbed on the first train. And we didn't know where it went, but it went westwards. And that's how we fetched up in Paris. Now, Paris is an unforgiving city for somebody in a torn coat and without money. And so there we were. And we then went to the British embassy saying, we want to come to Britain. And they said, oh, very good. You have to apply for a labor permit, and then you get a job, and then you can come to the UK. And we say, but how can we apply for a labor permit? We haven't got anything. We haven't eaten now for 2 days. And they said, hard luck. You have lost your refugee status when you quit the first country that you landed in. You crossed Austria. Then you lost your refugee status. You are no longer a refugee. You have to find a job. Otherwise, other than with a labor permit, you cannot enter the UK. Now, that is what took us 6 weeks of writing. We borrowed money. It's so bizarre. We met a kindly crippled professional footballer who was as poor as church mice, but he understood what hardship was, and he took pity on us, and he lent us 56 British pounds. We spent most of it on postage stamps, writing letter after letter in libraries, because libraries were heated places. So, and you could find the journals, so we wrote the letters. And we sent the letters, and we kept on receiving wonderful replies. Yes, 2 graduates, one of them, my husband, with 4 years of experience as a radar technician, engineer, and me with a beautiful, shiny, top-class degree of a great university. Oh yes, exactly the people. Come for interview. Well, we couldn't come for interview because we couldn't enter the country without a labor permit, and we couldn't get a labor permit without coming to the country for an interview. Catch-22, as you would call it. And then by chance, Pi Limited of Cambridge sent over a physicist who didn't know the first thing about electrical engineering. He came across to Paris to do a job, whatever. And he was told to interview these two stray people. And he did. And he started by saying, I don't know anything about electricity. And I said, and my husband doesn't speak a word of English. So that was the interview. Nevertheless, he reported back to Pi of Cambridge that they should try us. It would be worthwhile trying to give us a job. So that is how it happened.
Amazing.
Your very good question.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's crazy. Thank you.
I suppose you learned English very quickly, right on the job.
Well, I had English. My English was Shakespeare sonnet, Thomas More's Utopia, a segment of, and one of the stories of the Canterbury Tales. I did A-level English. This is studying those things. And that was it.
That must have been interesting conversations.
Well, there you are.
Well, thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Kaposi. I just want to mention a few things before I let everybody go. The first is to mention again, Dr. Kaposi's book, Yellow Star, Red Star, which is available on Amazon, and it's very easy to find, Kaposi. So
And it's very easy to read as well.
Yes, easy to read and easy to find, and I think everybody would enjoy it very much. And the last thing I just want to mention is our further programming. We are having a breakfast tomorrow morning in Renaissance Park 909 for a student presentation about his grandfather. Our first time doing this as a committee. We're calling it a third generation presentation, and the student is presenting about his grandfather, and we're going to listen to his late grandfather's first person testimony about his experiences. And on Thursday, we have two events: a visit to the Armenian Heritage Park on the Greenway in the morning, and in the evening, a talk by Jan Grabowski, who will be talking about, speaking of Holocaust distortion, but the Polish government's current use of the laws to control the memory of the Holocaust. And finally, on Friday, we're having a student and faculty lunch. You can just RSVP just by sending me an email. That is featuring Nicole Fox, who's coming to talk about her book on the Rwandan genocide. So lots more programming left. I'm sorry, student, faculty, and staff lunch for the university community. People, anybody who's working and studying here is very much invited. So thank you so much for joining us. Please participate in the rest of our events. And thank you so much, Dr. Kaposi, for sharing your experience, which will be archived in our digital repository service and in the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee archives.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Take care.